Apple Watch is the most widely used wearable in the world. More than 100 million people wear one. And while it can serve purely as a smartwatch to check your messages, control your music or add meetings to your calendar, it also functions as a kind of health monitor. Depending on the model, Apple Watch can record your heart rate, your blood oxygen saturation. It can even generate a single lead electrocardiogram, all from your wrist. So for many people, Apple Watch has become a daily report card on health, and Apple very much leans into this with their Dear Tim segments in their yearly update event, where they regale stories of users describing how the device alerted them to potentially serious medical conditions. But there is a core question here. Can the watch actually measure what it says it measures? You see, in digital health and medicine, accuracy is the foundation of trust. A heart rate that's off by a few beats per minute can change how a clinician interprets exertion or recovery. An error of a few percentage points in blood oxygen saturation can determine whether someone seeks care for hypoxemia. And when it comes to cardiorespiratory fitness, as I've talked about in other videos, a 5 milliliter per kilogram per minute difference in VO2 max, the margin seen in some device comparisons with the gold standard lab measure, well, that's been associated with a 20 to 25% difference in all-cause mortality risk over time. So to understand how much confidence we can place in this kind of data, we set out to examine all the available validation studies looking at Apple Watch to answer the question, how accurate is it, metric by metric, model by model? Okay, so when we talk about accuracy, we need to be precise about what that means. For any health metric, accuracy is established by comparing the device's readings to a criterion measure, the recognized gold standard. For heart rate, that's a chest strap electrocardiogram. For blood oxygen saturation, a medical grade pulse oximeter or arterial blood gas. For energy expenditure, indirect calorimetry or doubly labeled water. The list goes on. But to be included, a study had to use the correct criterion measure, the correct gold standard. Studies also had to provide sufficient detail of the protocol and context in which the device was assessed, how the measurement was taken, who the participants were, and under what conditions they were tested. So for example, heart rate accuracy during a slow walk tells us very little about accuracy during a sprint or during an episode of cardiac arrhythmia. We needed to know that context. One of the challenges with synthesizing all of the research in this space is that every time Apple rolls out new hardware or updates its algorithms, the process of validation has to start all over. So for example, the optical heart rate sensor in the Apple Watch has evolved through at least 3 generations. The original sensor up to about 2017, a second generation sensor introduced with the Series 4 around 2018, and a third generation sensor beginning with the Series 6 in 2020 that is still in use today. The implication for us was that a watch that was tested 2 years ago might not really be comparable to one that was tested yesterday. The hardware might be different. By the way, that rapid iteration is great for innovation, but from a validation perspective, it means evidence ages almost as fast as the product cycle. It makes it really hard for us researchers to keep up. Without this kind of good reporting, without consistent methods, and ultimately without continuous reassessment, the scientific picture fragments a bit. Clinicians see data that looks precise, but may not be reliable. Consumers assume medical grade accuracy where none has been demonstrated, and researchers struggle to compare studies that use different standards, devices, and participant groups. So that's the breach we set out to close. To do this, we assembled every available validation study of Apple Watch health metrics across all models and measurement contexts to see where we stand with the evidence. We searched 8 major scientific databases of research and identified 82 validation studies involving more than 430,000 participants covering every Apple Watch model up to the Series 9 and Ultra 2. This is what's known as a living meta-analysis, so our results will continue to update as new studies evaluating more recent models get published. Anyway, in those 82 studies, 14 distinct health metrics were evaluated. Let's look at what we found. Heart rate was the most validated metric. Across 38 studies, the Apple Watch showed strong agreement with gold standard ECGs, particularly at rest. During exercise though, accuracy decreased, especially during activities like strength training or interval style sessions. When we pooled the data, the mean bias was small, around minus 0.3 beats per minute, but the limits of agreement were wide, at roughly plus or minus 7 beats per minute. This means that on average, over the course of a full session say, accuracy was good, but when you drilled down into the individual heart readings, Apple Watch could both over and underestimate heart rate on a second-by-second basis. Accuracy also improved with newer sensors. the third generation optical heart rate sensor had narrower limits of agreement than earlier versions. For atrial fibrillation detection, sensitivity and specificity varied widely between studies. When aggregated, Apple's ECG app detected atrial fibrillation with about 79% sensitivity and 91% specificity, which is pretty good, but is tempered by the fact that 15 to 25% of tracings were inconclusive in many trials. Blood oxygen saturation, or SpO₂, was generally accurate in normoxic ranges, within about 1% of medical grade pulse oximeters, but performance dropped in hypoxic conditions. On average, Apple Watch slightly overestimated oxygen saturation, and variability increased as SpO₂ fell below 94%. Energy expenditure showed the widest margins of error. Across 8 studies, the mean absolute percentage errors often exceeded 20% and occasionally surpassed 100%, depending on the activity, which is quite poor. This actually reflects what we have seen in other consumer wearables. It seems that estimating the number of calories you have burned during different kinds of exercise is very difficult. When it comes to sleep-wake detection was found to be pretty reliable. In other words, Apple Watch could tell if you were asleep or awake, or when you woke up, but it was less accurate for classifying individual stages such as REM or deep sleep. And VO2 max estimation, validated in only one study, underestimated cardiorespiratory fitness by about 6 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is not trivial. It's a clinically meaningful difference. This was actually a study done in our lab, which I've done a separate video on. The upshot is that this is not necessarily a glowing report card for the Apple Watch, but it's certainly not terrible either. In my opinion, when it comes to risk-based measurements of these kinds of body signals, Apple has performed pretty well, about as well as I would have expected, and maybe a little bit better than its competitors based on similar meta-analyses of other devices. But several of its features remain largely unevaluated in independent studies. We didn't find any studies evaluating Apple Watch's recently released hypertension notification feature, its gait metrics like cadence or step length, or its women's health tracking features. And there was only one study looking at sleep apnea detection, Apple's own validation study, so there are big gaps in the literature. So what do these findings tell us about the role of Apple Watch and of wearables more broadly in health and medicine? First, performance is uneven, but it is improving. Apple Watch now measures some physiological signals with near clinical grade precision under controlled conditions, but it struggles when those same metrics are derived or indirect. That's not a failure of the technology so much as a reminder that sensing physiology from the wrist is a complex inference problem, influenced by motion, skin, articulation, and context. Second, validation has to be continuous, not episodic. Each new sensor generation or algorithm update effectively resets the evidence base. That's why a living review like ours becomes a kind of infrastructure for accountability. Without it, claims of clinical grade accuracy risk becoming historical footnotes within a year. Third, intended use matters. A margin of error that is acceptable for personal fitness tracking may not be acceptable for clinical decision making. For VO2 max, for example, a few milliliters per kilogram per minute can mark the difference between moderate and high cardiovascular risk. For heart rate monitoring during exercise, a 7-beat deviation, which is what we found, may not alter behavior, but in atrial fibrillation screening, similar variability could delay diagnosis. Finally, this work underscores a broader point. Data quality is the new frontier of digital health. As sensors proliferate and machine learning models integrate them into composite digital biomarkers, the validity of each underlying signal will determine the reliability of the whole system. The watch face may look sleek, but beneath it lies a chain of assumptions that must be tested, updated, and made transparent. In that sense, Apple Watch is less a finished medical device than a platform in transition. The promise is genuine, but realizing it will depend on rigorous, open, and ongoing validation.